Greetings and welcome once again to another iteration of MGTOW Talks. I am here today with a different guest, a guest I've not yet spoken to, at least in this context. That is Electus, chosen of the gods, and I would say a reasonable expert on Korean society. And what we're going to do today is talk about Korean society, the changes in Korean society, basically Korea under a microscope, South Korea specifically, obviously, and of course, women, well, male and female relations in this context. Now, this gentleman is uniquely qualified to speak of these things, and I will let him speak for himself on this issue. Electus, please.
Greetings, Stardust. Thank you for the very exalted titles. I must assure your
Not
audience that
not
I am not, in
exalted,
fact,
simply fitting, sir, simply fitting.
that I am not, in fact, the chosen of the gods. But
Okay.
we will move on from there. Um, you've asked me to talk about Korean society for two reasons. One, that I have lived there for 2 years teaching English, like you, although you were there more recently than I was, and the country is changing at a very rapid pace. So, from personal experience from living there, I can only speak about the time when I was actually there. I've continued to sort of follow things after leaving through the internet. I'm also been married to a Korean woman that I met there for the last 10 years. And although she is not typical of Korean women in general, I've been able to confirm, ask her, etc., about basic facts about Korean society as sort of a resource. So, you as well, we can sort of have a dialogue on this because you as well, again, have lived in Korea for, was it 2 years or 1 year?
It was well over 2 years. Yeah.
Well over 2 years. Okay, and you've also had a number of Korean ex-wives who might be considered more towards the mean of Korean female behavior than my wife. Um,
I would suspect so. Yes.
okay, so we can sort of mind meld here about Korean society as equals.
Well, I'm certainly not your equal, but I can offer some commentary. Now, I totally agree with you on the point that just based on my observations, and obviously I follow things on the internet as well, Korea just seems to change by the day. I mean, when I left sometime at the end of 2008 or thereabouts, you know, comparing now, 7 years hence, to then, it's a different country completely. I mean, I
Absolutely.
there's very little of that time. How does the adage go? The past is a different country. They do things differently there. Something along those lines.
Mm.
I I'm out of the loop in that respect. But I mean, there are still constants there that exist. And of course, one constant is the Neo-Confucianism. And we were talking off the record before, and we can make it on the record now,
Mm.
about this boating accident, or boating. It wasn't a boating accident. Sorry, it was basically a ship that that sank into the sea. But
Mm.
if you could give us some of the details of what happened and how that affected the whole Neo-Confucianism, Confucianistic model, and what have you.
Okay, well, this, bear in mind, is just sort of a theory that I have, just kind of explain that even in the past year, there's been appears to me to be a very rapid change in the behavior of young people in Korea. And I can even just see it when watching them on recent internet uh, videos and newscasts and, private blogs and things like that. And we're talking people who are younger than, I would say, 30 years old or 25 even. They're much more Americanized in their body language and in their the way they talk, and in even just the way they act around sort of authority figures. There's still the typical deference there because there's a lot of society pressure, of course, to maintain that, but it's you can see that it's kind of weakening. And anyway, the theory that I base that on, sort of it's not the cause, but it might be kind of a straw that broke the camel's back proverbially, was when the Sewol ferry, which is a ferry that runs between mainland Korea and Jeju Island, which is kind of Korea's kind of Hawaii.
Hawaii,
Yeah, if I were to put it, it's subtropical. It's not completely
yeah,
tropical, but it's the closest
totally
thing that we have.
overrated. But that's what Koreans do. They overrate stuff. Yeah,
Well,
totally.
I've actually never been there
I
myself. Have you?
have totally overrated, but please
Okay.
continue.
Apparently, they have a sex theme park there.
Yeah, I heard about that pay, but it's the oranges, right? It's Jeju oranges, best oranges in the
Kyul,
world,
Kyul,
according. Pardon?
Kyul.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, the little clementines. Yeah.
right. Sorry. Yeah. But anyway, please continue.
Yes. Yes. Um, okay, so this ferry basically, there was a kind of inexperienced third mate piloting the ship, steering the ship at the time, ferry, and it was also, by the way, I didn't mention this the last time, but it was also illegally overloaded with freight to save money by the corrupt ferry operators, and that has been something that's been going on for a long time. Um, which definitely contributed to the fact that the ferry could not right itself after um, the helmsman at the time made a swift turn. We still don't know why she made that turn. Um, she claimed in official depositions that it was because she saw another ship coming from the other direction and she was swerving to avoid it. But official records and other witnesses can reveal that there was in fact no such other ferry coming in the opposite
Uh,
direction. So that's probably just a lie. Yes, you were
since,
going to
but
say something.
since this was a female, I think I remember this as well that she received unique treatment,
She received
though in fact
very
she had
differential. Yeah.
been, it seemingly primarily responsible for this
Yes.
accident.
Yes. Um, she received very deferential treatment from the media. Her face was protected, shielded. They never published her face. She was kept in the official sort of lineup in front of the cameras in order to confess and apologize to the public. You know, kind of the Korean way, where you stand in front with your head bowed and your hands held, and 죄송합니다, um, which is kind of obligatory after every time in a Korean newscast they kind of interview a criminal and they catch him. The criminal is always puts on that kind of show of contrition. It's kind of ironic, you might find like a mass murderer on camera who's done terrible things, and then they're kind of sitting there like a scolded school child with their head bowed, going 죄송합니다, as if that will endear them. Um, but no, this woman didn't say anything. She was kept in the back. She was covering her face, crying, being treated very delicately by the police, who were trying to keep the cameras away. On the contrary, there are two male crew members, including the captain, who were with her at the time of this official public parade. After the incident, were put front and center. They were made to have their heads bowed, their faces were shown, they were apologetic, etc., etc. So there's definitely very chivalrous treatment for the female who was actually the one who was the primary cause of the accident.
And I think you mentioned that she had in the text messages said that she was going to pin the blame on the male crew members, or how did that go?
Yep. Well, the
The
captain, who
captain,
was an
yes.
elderly male. Yeah. This is called 책임회피 in Korean, which is shifting the blame or the responsibility. That's in fact the words she used in chatting with her friends on Kakao Talk, which is kind of a Korean Skype, right after the accident when the boat was like tilting and they were all kind of huddling down and trying to maintain balance. And yeah, she said she was gonna pin it on the captain. She lied about there being a problem, a technical mechanical problem with the steering gear, which there was not. Um, and I believe also there was a mechanic who was beside her who also claimed that there was a gear problem, so it wasn't unique to her. Um, and she was the first. Well, let me tell you in the context of sort of the effect on the whole Neo-Confucian hierarchy in Korean society that this might have had, according to my theory, which is that young people must obey their elders, but the elders must protect and look after the young people. So what happened was on this ferry there was a class of high school class, I believe it was a high school class, yeah, going for their school field trip to Jeju Island. Um, and they were told once the ship initially started capsizing to those who were in their cabins and below decks to stay where they were and not to move because it would be dangerous. And this message, and there are videos of this from children who uploaded their real-time videos to their social media websites while the sinking was happening. You can hear the loudspeakers, the public announcement system, the crew going, "Stay where you are, stay where you are, don't move, it could be dangerous, stay where you are." This is repeated several times. Then the messages stopped coming, and that's because the crew had fled completely from the ship, including, of course, the female crew member who was the first one off the ship, that's shown in the videos, who was kind of just helplessly dangling down from a rope and led away by the Coast Guard. Then came the captain in his underwear. It's kind of comical. Anyway, you can find this all on the internet if you Google it.
Yeah.
They never told the children, "Okay, you can come out now. The rescuers are here. Come and get to safety." They just left them after telling them to stay put, and they obeyed, and they obeyed to their deaths. They sat there obeying their elders until the water was up to their necks and they drowned. Of course, some of them by that time had realized, hey, we better escape, and they tried to escape, but it was too late by that time because the ship was already filled with water and they couldn't get out. They couldn't open the doors, couldn't break the windows, etc. The only ones who survived, the only children who survived this incident were those who disobeyed the call to stay where they were and said, "Fuck this, I'm getting off the ship." So this kind of put a sort of a questioning of authority for the first time, I think, for the real first time. I mean, aside from all of the kind of protests against dictatorship and all that stuff, and just sort of ideologically motivated
Right.
to change the government
In
back
late
in the
80s.
80s,
Yeah.
and things
88.
like that, protests.
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily call that a challenging of the concept of authority. I would just call that the phenomenon of wanting to change the system,
Yeah.
to a different form of government.
We
But
should just mention that up until 1988, South Korea essentially had a puppet dictator in the employ of the U.S. government, essentially a continuation of the Cold War strategies. And there were, in fact, there have been data released on the Yeongju massacre. You probably heard about that. That occurred. I think it was 80. It was 88. Was it? I might be off on that mark.
yeah, the Gwangju, I
Gwangju.
believe,
Gwangju. It's not. It wasn't
Gwangju
Gyeongju. It was in
massacre. Yeah,
Gwangju, right? And
yeah.
apparently the
It's where
CIA fed.
I met my wife, incidentally.
Oh, well, congratulations. That's in Gwangju, and that apparently the CIA was feeding them information. And post 1988 was the first time South Korea had ever experienced any semblance of quote unquote normal democracy. Before that there was the war, and before that was Japanese colonialism. So anyway, but I think you're spot on about that. This incident with the ferry probably sparked a slight change in attitude there. But I want to link this to another topic that I've often thought about, and you being Electos might have a better idea of this. Incidentally, Electos is not just an expert on Korean matters; he's a chemical engineer and a neuroscientist as well, degreed, mind you.
Not working in the fields,
Not
but I
working in
do
those
have those
fields, but
degrees,
degreed. Yeah. Anyway,
and
and an amateur Hellenist to boot. So there you go. But I often think about the differences between the development of society in the Occident and the Orient. And sometimes it is quite puzzling because, of course, there were authoritarian models and what have you in the West, without a doubt. Uh, there wasn't something that was really on par with the kind of thing that eventually became Neo-Confucianism. I mean, Neo-Confucianism, by the way, is just a way of putting or describing a new kind of an offshoot of the original set of principles and philosophies.
Mm.
What do you think is, if anything, unique to the Orient culturally? Everyone likes talking about culturally that distinguishes it such that it could have it so had readily embraced, and not just South Korea, obviously Japan, and up until fairly recently, until the Maoist revolution, China as well. What do you think led to that sort of massive embracing of this kind of rigid hierarchical societal structure?
You mean in the past?
In the past and up into the present. I mean, as you said, it is
Well, what's happening in
waning.
the present is a holdover from the past.
Well, that's my point. It is waning, but it's still present. I mean, you don't. First off, you don't see people in any Western country getting on their hands and knees and begging forgiveness
Mm.
with polite morphological endings or anything like that.
Mm.
That's something along the lines of what I mean. What qualities, if any, do you see in the Orient that led to such a division, and if you will, or just a completely different way of looking at society in some respects, at least?
Um, so in terms of that, the apology gesture that you mentioned, I would exclude China from that probably. I
Yeah,
mean, they
true enough.
probably used to have that, but it's been a long time since
Well,
they
they
had
had
those
up
kind of.
until the Maoist revolution, they did have a pretty thorough Confucianist tradition.
Yeah, up until basically the empire ended. But after that,
I think
I mean,
Japan and Korea are better holdovers of that.
yeah,
Yeah.
I really don't think that that kind of level of extreme deference still exists in Chinese
No,
society
no, no,
today.
does not in China. It's gone. Believe me. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but they've just always had a more collectivist mentality in which the welfare of the group was seen as both paramount and equivalent to, or paramount over and equivalent to, the welfare of the individual. So they've always been focused on how to make society a well-oiled machine, um, for the benefit of society as a whole, because the individual's own identity was wrapped up with the identity of the society as a whole, and not as an individual. Uh, I think that's just the way
Yeah. And
that they evolved. Their societies evolved.
as simply a different response to effective, I guess you could say, selection pressures. The West took a different route, obviously,
Mm,
but this is probably one of the most profound, quote unquote, cultural differences between, say, countries such as South Korea and Japan and a Western country.
mm,
And and you can even arguably see it encoded in the morphology of the language. I hope not to get too technical. That is the
yes,
word endings for those who are unfamiliar and what have you.
yes.
That and of course your Korean is far better than mine. What I mean, if you count the means of addressing, say, the emperor, there are about seven different possible ways. No.
Well, in Korean language, which I think has the most varied, uh, the most intricate grammatical complexity when it comes to social status,
Yeah.
um, even more so than Japanese. Japanese is actually relatively simple compared to Korean. Um, but Korean has, let's see, about six different registers of address,
Let me
and it's
clarify,
all.
guys.
Yeah.
Not everyone is linguists here. A register is a different way of speaking and a different way of addressing people. So, for example, if I say I ain't got no time, that's a different register as opposed to saying I do not have any time. Just please continue.
Also, I mean, this is better demonstrated when, say, making requests of people, for example. So you say, "Give me that." That's a much in English you can intuitively grasp when you say, "Give me that." That's a much lower level of politeness and formality than, "Would you please pass me that?"
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So in English we use auxiliary verbs and other circumlocutions to express different levels of formality and politeness, but it's not encoded in grammatical conjugations but in Korean it is. So literally the form of the verb will take on a different shape or a different conjugation based upon the social status of both, and this is in Korean, not in Japanese actually, of both the person you are addressing and the person you are talking about in the third person, even. So you have to keep both of these combinations in mind. So um, the 6 different registers apply to only to the person you are talking to. But then there's an honorific infix, which expresses the idea that the person you are talking about is esteemed, is um, is of higher social status than you, um, and that must be expressed even if you are talking about someone in the third person. So, for example, if you are addressing your best friend since grade school, and so you'll use the casual style and you won't use an honorific infix when talking to that person. But if you talk to that person referring in and talk about your parent in the third person, you must use the casual style with your friend, but insert the honorific infix when using verbs that refer to actions that your parents do.
Yeah.
Okay. And then there are also special vocabulary items on top of that that vary based on the social status of the person you are talking to. So, for instance, when you talk about, you say you talk about the emperor. So, the word for food in Korea, in Korean, varies from probably the lowest level of formality, which is pop, which just means rice, literally, but means a meal by extension. And then shiksa, which means more formally a meal, which is a loan word from Chinese. In fact, I think all the rest are um, loan words from Chinese. And then uh, I forget the third. I think there's a third word that refers to the food that people of higher social status than you eat, and I forget what it is. But then there's the king's food, which is chinji.
That one I actually didn't know. So there you go.
Yeah.
Learn something new every day.
So, which is at the very top. So, if you're referring to the monarch's food, there's another special word that you have to use. You can't just, you don't say meal, whereas in English you'd say the king's food, my food, your food.
But one thing I think that is important to stress is people, and I'm in the midst of preparing a video, well, not on the specific topic, but related topics. People look at something like that in Korean, and then they just see this complete element of the foreign in it. But the reality is, it's not encoded in English, obviously. But no,
Yeah.
we use inversion. We use things like sir. Excuse me.
Oh, it's a universal language feature. It's just
It's just has it
less. Yeah.
expresses itself slightly differently depending on the language.
Yeah.
And I think people, in looking for continuity in human features, language being a very prominent human feature, it's important that we not lose track of things. People spend eons. I mean, in my former area of expertise, say German or Germanic philology, people would spend just the incredible amounts of time claiming things such as this word, this philosophical abstraction is impossible to render in English, and da da da. And I think language universals are always present, even if they don't see. And look, European languages are somewhere in between that for the most part. There are you have it's just the verbs and the pronouns that will receive some sort of different conjugation to indicate whom you're talking to. And then, of course, modern English, which used to have these forms, it doesn't have any of that, officially at least. But just thought that's important to bear in mind. But what we see there with the regards to how Eastern society developed is, I've talked about this before, and in a probabilistic model, deterministic, whatever, however we want to term it, you're going to get you can get a whole bunch of different outcomes. You don't need just one outcome to say, well, this is completely different from that, and blah blah blah. People often get lost in cultural differences. What everyone, I think, every human society on some level places or assigns value to the quote unquote collective, right?
Mm.
And we just see it to a different degree in South Korea. Now, what are your thoughts on what I like to call the crushing of creativity? The South Koreans, it seems, they're very good at rote memorization, and they get good grades and yada yada yada. But when it comes to actual creative thought, when it comes to creative analysis, they seem to fall short. What do you think?
Yeah, before I go to that topic, I would just like to make a minor correction. I believe chinji can also be used for the food of extremely respected elders, not just a monarch, but it's certainly old-fashioned
Okay,
to
didn't know
use it
that
in
one.
that way. Um, okay, about creativity. I've had this discussion with my wife, who is a graduate student, and we've kind of both noticed that. So the UN, some agency of the UN that has to do with world education, rated South Korea as having the best educational system in the world, and they were mainly referring to pre higher education, basically from elementary to high school, which is the American way of referring to it, and also the Korean way. Korean uses the same terms as American. I know Europe might use very different terms to refer to the different levels of grade school. But I'm not sure what criteria they used to determine that. But certainly, Korean students come out of high school with a much greater retention of facts. So, for example, the right mathematical equation to use for a certain type of problem. They'll know very well. But the way they learn math is they memorize a single form of equation for a specific type of problem. And they'll memorize, say, 100 different kinds of equations rather than going through the derivation of going from one equation to another on the fly based on thinking about the way the problem is structured, the knowns, the unknowns, etc. What you need to do to creatively transform the equation based on your needs to apply it to a new situation, right? So you can see the difference there between those two approaches. Now, they come out of high school with a very good ability to immediately and very quickly answer problems so long as they're familiar with them. But the moment they hit something that is not of a form that they have memorized, it's a problem. It causes a stall. And when you are in high school, and even to some extent when you are an undergrad, this is a useful skill because you must memorize a lot of primary information. But when you get to graduate school, that technique starts to break down because graduate school is all about coming up with new ideas, critical thinking, proposing hypotheses that no one has thought of before. And you can't rely on the memorization model anymore. And so Korean graduate students, and this, I hope I'm not offending anyone, but in my and her observation, tend to be less able to think creatively and come up with project ideas and hypotheses and new things for graduate level work. In the biomedical sciences, where I got my PhD, Asian students were very popular because they work very hard and long hours. And when you, to some extent, uh, professors who run labs in the biomedical sciences, which receive a lot of funding, and they have to crank out a lot of publications to justify that funding, run like businesses almost. And to them, I'm not saying this is the right way, but a lot of them, just because of the necessities of their situation, see their graduate students as essentially as employees, as technicians. And so they really like Korean students, Japanese students, etc., because they can just tell them what to do, and they'll go into the lab and do it repeatedly for 12 hours, and crank out a shit ton of data, right? Um, but that also, so they will succeed as graduate students in very well in those kinds of fields, um, where their mentor can basically tell them what the hypothesis is and what the project is, and they'll just go and execute it in the lab very, very assiduously and with great attention to detail. But even that is a different thing from creative or critical thinking. So I think that educational. Now, this is not to say that this is anything intrinsic in racially or anything like that. It's just the way that the educational system is structured over there. And this also goes back to Neo-Confucianism. This all goes back to Confucianism, where the teacher is an extremely respected and high authority figure whom you do not question. And your role as a student is to simply sit there and absorb what the teacher tells you. You don't speak, you don't react, you don't debate, you don't talk, you just listen. And that definitely shows up when you have a class of, say, in university or in graduate school, where you have a class of a mix of Western students and Asian students. The Asian students, I don't mean Asian American, I mean Asian from Korea, like who were educated in that system. Very quiet, don't really ask questions, um, and just write down whatever the professor says. Whereas, and don't like to be asked questions, in fact. And when you ask that, when the professor will ask them a question, it's almost painful, um, uh, to watch them try to summon up
I
the courage to
remember
respond.
I remember asking my ex-wife, my last ex-wife, questions, and the answer was just, I don't know, in an annoyed tone, of course.
Mm, mm.
And I think I've observed this as well. I think there are,
Now, I will say China is not like that anymore. I will say Chinese students are not like that. Um,
yeah, yeah. I
they
get
they
the
are they have,
feeling,
yeah, they are not afraid to talk and debate and stuff in class, and yeah.
well,
So I'll just say that.
but we were talking about as well the breakdown of this slowly but surely. Now, in that video I posted fairly recently, I found out that there's another version of monoculture. I'm not going to talk about that one related to, feminism and Marxism, blah blah blah. But the version of monoculture that I proposed in that video, which I think you watched,
Mm.
do you see? I mean, this seems to just be a very clear case of that. I mean, as Neo-Confucianism breaks down, and specifically, what are your thoughts? As someone who's been knee deep in the business, as it were, on the legalizing of adultery in South Korea. Not knee deep in adultery, but knee deep in marriage and what have you. Yeah.
Nothing stops the engine of gynocentrism, not even Neo-Confucianism, and it may put it on hold for a while because of environmental circumstances. But when those change, you will get a universal effect. And so, as far as the adultery law goes, well, first of all, let me explain to you the traditional marriage system in Korea. And this will probably come as a shock to even Westerners who embrace a quote unquote traditionalist mindset. But in Korea, and I think also Japan, although I'm not sure, the traditional model is that the husband, of course, the husband earns all the money and the wife stays at home, but the husband turns over his entire paycheck to the wife for management. He does not have control over the money that he earns, the wife does. and the wife controls all the bank accounts. The wife controls all the finances. The wife is the one who decides how the money in the house is going to be spent, and graciously dispenses a an allowance, literally like a child, to her husband for his own personal uses in cash, because if he had a bank card, he would be able to just use whatever's in the bank, right? So in cash, on a weekly or monthly basis or what have you, just like to her children. Um, and that is the traditional model. Now, under Neo-Confucianism, now I wondered where this came from, and I asked my wife, is this a Confucian thing? And I don't know for sure, and she doesn't know for sure, but she said that she seemed to think that it was because under the Confucian system, the men are responsible for running the state, and the women are responsible for running the house in a harmonious, well-oiled system. And so, to run the house without having the husband involved in the minutiae of that, the wife needs control of the finances. So, we think that that does, in fact, date back to Confucianism, but once you have modernization kick in, it's the same old story, right? The woman keeps those privileges of the old system to which she's become accustomed, but she sheds those restrictions that were put on her behavior because hey, equality and all that, right? Likewise, the man loses his privileges because equality, but he retains all of his old obligations. So that has led to a situation where women in Korea, of course, have equal rights and all, but they don't have to serve in the military. And we'll get to the military in just a second because that's also a big issue. But the traditional model has more or less remained in place. I really don't know what 20 somethings who get married, what their arrangement is now. I really don't know that. But still, for say the 30s and above, and I've met several men when I was in Korea who had this arrangement that they just they earn the money, but they don't see a dime of it. I mean, it just all goes into their wife's bank account, and their wife decides how it's going to be spent and how much the man is going to get, the husband's going to get for his own uses. So that is traditionalism, at least the traditionalism of the wife's privileges in Korea.
So, what do you think looking past the veil of lies, as it were, what do you think the real motivation was behind the quote unquote legalization of adultery in South Korea when formerly, there was a penalty, that you could actually
Well,
be sent to jail for that?
this law was obviously never meant to apply to women. Um, it can't, and the reason it can't is because there are two there are two punishments for it. One is a fine, and the other is jail time. And jail time was extremely rare. Be quiet, Mocha. Be quiet. Jail time was extremely rare. Um, Most of the time was a fine, right? Now, if you had a woman, which prosecuting women also for this was pretty rare back in the day when not completely, but women were a little bit more circumspect about their affairs. Um, if you find a woman, right, where is her money coming from? It's all coming from her husband, the injured party, right? So, what? How is she going to pay this fine without penalizing the person the party who she wronged, right? It just doesn't make sense. So obviously, a fine for a woman is not a workable punishment. And then prison, you're going to imprison a mother of children who has to be there and take care of them and all that stuff. The same exact reasoning that goes on in the West to give women lighter sentences. You're very uncomfortable in doing that.
One thing I noticed in light of the whole legalization thing was the
Which I'll get to
claim
in just a second.
was the claim that men had begun to take advantage of the illegality of adultery and try to use it to blackmail their wives. I'm not sure what that alleged blackmail actually entailed
I
because
don't
it's
know,
never
but
described.
I would imagine that it's simply trying to get a better deal in divorce court. My wife committed adultery, therefore I shouldn't have to give her as much money. Um, which is what women do when, in the exact same way, when they catch their husbands committing adultery and they've been convicted of this crime, they leverage for a better deal in divorce court, right? So it's something that women have always been doing, but when they become the victims of it, all of a sudden they cry bloody murder.
Well, it's
So
not too dissimilar to the slowly, I say, very slowly growing reality in a place like the United States, where some women, not many, are now having to pay. What is it? They call it manimony.
alimony, well,
Well, they call it.
officially alimony, but
Yes, but
there are all
right,
kinds of euphemisms.
right. Well, manimony is more something more acrimonious than that. But
I've also heard way back from Tom Likas vagina money.
right. No, well, vagina. No. The manimony is very specific. It's women resenting having to pay alimony to their man.
I
Manimony.
see. Okay, yeah, I see. Gotcha.
Yeah. All right. So yeah. So then this is becoming an issue, of course, and I think you can see this pretty much across the globe. The minute women are affected by something, it's an issue. The men can be affected by something for decades and quite severely,
Exactly,
but
exactly. That's the exact case in this situation.
I mean, and
Nobody
one thing,
cared.
I don't know if you remember this video I made a while back, but I documented the rate of divorce increase
Yep.
corresponding to the Southeast slash Korean financial crisis in the late 90s.
Yeah, I
It went
watched
through
that.
the stratosphere.
Yeah.
And I mean, these universals are just too omnipresent, really, to ignore, I think.
Yeah, and I'll in just a moment I'll give you another Korean example of to add to the data of that. But um, yeah, nobody cared about repealing the adultery law when it was only primarily men who were being charged and punished. But when you started getting a significant number of women being charged and punished, now all of a sudden it's a problem. It's a limitation of personal rights. It's not the government's business. It's et cetera, whatever the reasoning is that they use to repeal it. Now, this whole push to repeal it started when um, you had a famous Korean, I believe a Korean actress, Ok Sori,
Yeah, that was her.
who
Oxley, yeah.
was convicted and actually given a jail sentence, although it was suspended and she never actually served it. It was more like a
Slap on
in
the
name.
wrist.
I wouldn't say slap on the wrist. It was more like the principle of the thing. We're
All
going
right.
to officially put down on the books that you've got prison time, but we're not actually going to send you to prison.
Hmm.
Um, and it was easier to in court to charge her of this because she is a woman of independent means and very wealthy, right?
Hmm.
And is independent woman. She in this case you can actually charge this woman with fines or whatever, and she's not dependent on her husband. So she started a whole campaign, and the whole theme of her campaign to repeal this adultery law. And by the way, the blackmail thing also, I think, comes in when you're talking mostly when you're talking about celebrities, like female celebrities. They'll, if you discover that um, they've committed adultery or somebody has, they might try to blackmail them so the word doesn't get out. I'm sure it's the same with male celebrities though too. I mean, men don't want to have a reputation for philandering either. But of course, it's only a problem when women are blackmailed. Um, Men are very much more even than women, subject to the pressures of being blackmailed by and shame by Korean society. In fact, the for just such a reason, it didn't have anything to do with adultery, but the previous two presidents ago of Korea committed suicide over just such an issue of shame. But anyway, back to the adultery repealing. She started a campaign saying, and this you can already see here, where the westernization, the breakdown of Confucianism, the individuality of the female specifically is trumping all of this societal restriction, because her whole argument about why, well, the main point of her argument about why the adultery law should be repealed is because sex should not be made illegal, right? That was her catchword. Sex should not be illegal. You're criminalizing sex. You prudes, right?
Well, that and I mean, this is something we see repeatedly that
Now,
women's rights are
only a woman could get away with arguing about that
women's
to
rights are
yeah,
human rights. She made the argument, if I recall correctly, that this entire procedure had been a violation of her human rights.
of her human rights, yes, because she has the right to decide who and when she will have sex with, right?
Yeah.
And that's the basic human right. I'll tell that to the all the involuntary celibates. But anyway, um, she campaigned on that, and for a while it didn't. I mean, the justice system didn't respond to it, but eventually, and it eventually bore fruit, and we saw that with whether directly or indirectly, I don't know the exact specifics, but once a prominent woman started agitating for the repealing, a prominent and popular woman started agitating for the repeal of the adultery law, it did not take long at all for it to come down. A man could not have done this.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's just one more example. Now, about divorce statistics and things like that. There was a pretty unique phenomenon in Jeju. Actually, we were just discussing Jeju for since I think the 1700s, actually, where for whatever reason, and there are various theories about it. The main money-making hard work, which was for Jeju, diving for seafood, shellfish, and pearls, was done by women. And so therefore they were the breadwinners on the island. So here you have a relatively isolated society because it's on an island. And the theories about why women were the ones who adapted to do this are, I think there are three theories. No one knows for sure. One is that all the men were constantly being drafted into the Navy and shuttled off and never seen again. So the women had to fend for themselves. Um, or that the government had high taxes on men who were divers, and since it was phrased in the way of men who were divers, they exploited a loophole that it didn't apply to women, and so therefore women became the divers so they could avoid taxes. And the other theory is that women, because they have a higher percentage of body fat, were better able to withstand the cold temperatures deep beneath the ocean. Um, who knows what the real reason is, but they became the primary breadwinners. Now, it wasn't a complete reversal in the sense that the man of the household now all of a sudden had all the same rights and responsibilities that, well, he had the responsibilities of raising the children, but he didn't have, say, complete control over the family finances and giving his wife an allowance and all that stuff like on the mainland in reverse. No, no. He existed in the household at his wife's whim and could be thrown out at a moment's notice if he displeased his wife. Um, Women used the more successful pearl divers. They're called henya, which means sea woman, he sea and nya woman. Um, Often put their own husbands into the official positions of power in the village so that they could control them behind the scenes, etc., etc. Now, you come to modernization, you come to easy divorce, you come to basically easy transportation between the mainland and the island, and all of a sudden, what do you see in the modern era? Jeju had the highest divorce rate of any province in Korea. So,
In recent times.
in recent times, so the hypergamous instinct was unleashed. Women now realized they no longer had to settle for men who were of lower socioeconomic status than them, and they chucked them.
Mm. You know, with respects to the sea women, I mean, of course, it's quite different from some other professions, but we see a not too dissimilar phenomenon in countries that wouldn't be wouldn't qualify as industrialized nations, where women are willing to do things to get out of poverty, to get out of a basically poor financial straits, simply for that reason that they
Mm.
otherwise wouldn't be inclined to do, studying things like engineering, computer science, not because they have a particular interest in it, but because it's
The utility.
financially, yeah, it gets them out of a bad situation. And then
Yeah.
of course there have been studies, they've done these studies in Scandinavia where the most quote unquote egalitarian countries have women just doing the lightest load possible and doing exactly what they want, and with the fewest representatives of their kind in
Mm.
these professions that tend to be much more dominated by men. So it just seems under very extreme circumstances, women are willing to do certain things, but the minute there's some loosening
Mm.
of the strictures or rather the fabric of that particular society, it almost seems unidirectional as to what women tend to do.
Mm. It's very predictable.
It's exactly that. I think,
Yeah.
speaking of EP, evolutionary psychology, much of which, almost all of it, which revolves around analyzing the sexes and how they interact, we can't guarantee it 100%, but I think we could take a similar society that has not yet reached industrialization, and then let's say there's some prediction that in 20 years' time it will, and we could see a very similar phenomenon. I think we could predict that with a high degree of probability and
Mm.
accuracy. This just seems to be a universal, and but you don't see this kind of thing talked about in the mainstream. I mean, to the extent that I still harbor any ambition of getting into academia, you and I have talked about this,
Mm.
particularly in evolutionary psychology. So one of the things I would like to do is put the information we've been gathering here in the MGTOW community in an official academic context, put it out there. I
Mm.
mean, it's not no longer groundbreaking in the sense, but it's certainly eye opening to if we were in a position or I were in a position to put out data on dozens of different countries to see the correlations, and I think so many correlations that you probably could in all likelihood call it causation. And but as Gorai Twet said in that video I did with her, that would put women in a really bad light.
Yeah. You still can't yet widely publicize and publish data that is unflattering to women.
Yeah,
It's still kind of taboo.
yeah,
And
and
even when you do, you kind of have to phrase it in a way that excuses them for it.
oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, even Steven Pinker, I'm reading his Better Angels of Nature now. I mean,
Yeah.
not never mind the blank slate, but even in this book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, it's just filled with all sorts of strange, backhanded apologetics to women, feminists,
And
and
you will never know whether he actually believes that or if
exactly.
he's just saying that because he wants just to get his book published and not be censored.
I think that's the mystery. But if I were a betting man, I would say that men such as he or Richard Dawkins, anyone in that area, who's actually very well aware, very knowledgeable. I mean, Pinker is a psychologist, but he's a polymath. I mean, he knows all about evolution, and Dawkins is basically a evolutionary biologist. These
Mhm.
people know this stuff, and so of course they have to hold back, and that's a real shame because we need. I think academia. We've talked about just the stifling nature of official academia in general, privately, but I
Mhm.
think this really needs to be brought to bear. I mean, when I think about the very limited number of studies done, for example, on female and group preference, where really no conclusion is drawn whatsoever. Nobody tries to posit anything. Nobody offers a hypothesis. It's just looks like women dig helping out other women, and men even dig helping out women. And that's it.
Yeah, it's like in most papers when you write the conclusion section, you want to write about how your study has contributed to the field of human health and well-being and how it's going to advance some kind of technology
Yeah,
that's going to
yeah.
help people. But when it comes to findings that are unflattering to women, you do not want to draw those conclusions because it would force you to say, well, maybe
They,
women should, change their behavior. And they don't want to even suggest
they
that.
don't even need to do
So,
that much. All they need to do is take, once again, an EP, evolutionary psychological perspective. You know, here we have the data, right? Women seem to universally display this in group preference, and men towards women, but not men towards other men. What is the hypothesis? What environmental, that is, selection pressures could have led to this sort of psychological development in women? They don't even want to offer a hypothesis for that.
mhm.
So it's funny, but you know, we can make all this progress in the mechanical sciences and all the biological sciences unrelated to human beings, but the minute you start talking about stuff like this, I mean, I don't think it's a shame. There's no
Mm.
need for someone like uh, Pinker to offer strange, weird apologetics. I think it's safe to say, given the violence of the past, I mean, yeah, nobody had it particularly good. And on balance, and this has been a raging debate recently in the MGTOW community, and so
Well,
I
even
get
to say nobody had it particularly good, implying that both men and women were equally
no, no, no. I'm about to say,
disadvantaged, even that goes against the narrative.
right, 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 right. I mean, nobody had it particularly good, and there has been this debate as to what the definition of gynocentrism is. I think there's a biological continuity. Everyone knows my view on this, but the
Mhm.
fact is, most of the time, if you look at historical documents, and there are documents beyond the Bible, someone pointed out that Coltane, you might have watched his video, reference to the biblical scene in Leviticus, might have been Deuteronomy, but in any event, in the Old Testament, this is fictitious, but this was representative of the views of these people, and there are accounts by Mesopotamians that are actual historical accounts. So on aggregate, usually women were spared. They might have been sex slaves, but they certainly lived on to pass their genes. And I think Girl Writes What put it really well many moons ago when she said, if you're property and viewed as a precious gem, you're certainly going to be able to treat it a lot better than, well, someone you're just going to cut down and get rid of. So it's it's a pity that academia is so closed off, and we've kind of veered a little bit away from the Korean phenomenon. But
Uh,
one
you,
one
you know,
thing one thing I've noticed, supposedly this was back in the day. Maybe things have changed. I mean, to use the colloquial term "pussy whipped," Korean men in the presence of their
mhm,
wives or girlfriends,
mhm.
they they carrying their handbag, like little things, carrying their handbags,
Yeah,
listening to
yeah,
their nonsense.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I think to bring in this stuff in the discussion as well. When I look at my ex-wives, or think about my ex, which is rare, my Korean ex-wives, one of one of the biggest points of resistance, I think, in those marriages was always that I'm I'm flexible in some respects, but inflexible in others. I'd say point blank, I'm not interested in going to your fucking clothing store and looking
Mhm.
at fucking rags and tatters, and I'm not going to pretend that's interesting. I'm also not going to carry your fucking handbag. You have arms and shoulders. Carry it yourself. So my lack of interest in supplicating them might have shocked them a little bit, and I don't think that's something that Korean women in particular are used to. And I think
Yeah.
the other thing that's really fascinating is that obviously the East in general, Asia as a whole, though they can be quite distinct culturally, is still under this mystique. You'll hear men, particularly in the manosphere, go on about, well, Western women, Canadian, American, blah blah, European, blah blah blah, but Asian women, and this includes
Mhm.
basically the entire continent. I mean, they've never been to Korea and they've never experienced Korean women. And under the veil of quote unquote patriarchy, that the old style patriarchy of Neo-Confucianist South Korea, I mean, you have some of the most pussy whipped, uh, at least socially enslaved men to their wives, possibly on planet Earth. Uh,
Well, we
Comments?
see we see that from the the observation that I mentioned close to the beginning, which is that the women control the money if they're
Yeah.
married officially. You cannot do anything to displease your wife in that situation. But one thing I want to point out about, and I think this goes for Asian women in general, not just Koreans, in the West, the whole feminist sexual revolution thing, it became a symbol of resisting traditional gender roles, of rebelling against sexism, etc., to shun those chivalrous gestures and to see them in a negative way, at least for a time. And Western women who've grown up in that educational system, at least to some extent, absorb this sense that if someone holds the door open for you or thinks that treats you in a delicate way, etc., that they're implying that you're weak and that they're being sexist towards you, etc. And so some Western women or Western women in general will understand at the very least if you don't automatically start giving all sorts of ladylike chivalrous gestures to them, standing up for them on the bus, holding their bags, and all that other stuff, because it's become part of the culture to, due to that influence of the sexual revolution, to shun those chivalrous gestures as a statement that you are a strong woman, right? This never happened in Asia. They never acquired that kind of mindset, that never got into the, even in the feminist movements in Asia that were successful in getting their ideas into the educational system. So although Korean women still expect and believe in quote unquote equal rights, they also fully expect and don't see any contradiction in all of the traditional deference to womanhood and to ladies and to being a woman. They expect that automatically, and that's something that men just have to do and that they deserve because they're women, and that's just the way it is, and there's no questioning it, right? So I think you may find that if you compare your Korean ex-wives versus your European ex-wives, you might kind of see that difference there. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, my most recent Korean ex-wife, I mean, she had effectively immigrant. Well, she moved to the United States. Moved. She lived and went to high school in the United States. I think she went there when she was 15 or so, maybe
Mm,
16. And so you had this kind of weird melding of a lot of Korean stuff. Some of the I'd always retrospectively some of the worst habits of South Korea, along with some of the worst cultural things you can pick up from the United States. One of I mean, one of the most vapid and vacuous people I've actually encountered in my life, at least or had intimate relations with, put it that way.
mm,
And yeah, I mean, she certainly had no problem with any of the chivalry stuff. But one thing when I think back on it that was different, and I think was probably in somehow picked up or inherited from the Western thing, is that in Korea, though, usually this is I have a friend who is more or less married to a Korean woman. I mean, yeah, you have all the chivalry, you pay them, and it's the old
mm,
money for sex thing. They fuck you.
mm.
It's not a
Yeah,
big deal.
right.
My ex-wife used to just I'd pay for a fucking dinner, I'd do all this shit, and she would get in her fucking moods and still not fucking put out.
Mm,
And I would always think, that's very not Korean because I had a previous ex-wife who was much more standard Korean in that sense. And yeah, you do the thing you're supposed to do as a man, and she'd fucking suck your dick and fuck you. And I think that was so my final ex-wife was really, I guess, revealing in a sense the sort of melding of the two. So the worst aspects of so the princess spoil me Korean thing with the I'm still gonna do what I want even after you spoiled me and given me all the things I wanted anyway.
Right, right.
It was
It's just
nauseating.
keeping
Yeah.
the best of both worlds and the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
restrictions of neither.
It was pretty bad. Whereas the
Yeah.
previous Korean ex-wife was much more sort of standard. But even in her case, um, she was in the UK and I was living there at the time as well. When I think back of her, if I recall right, she was doing a PhD in either biology or biochemistry. And as someone who's at least peripherally always interested in these subjects, I tried to ask her about it. And she's had, I thought this was a woman who's pursuing a freaking PhD in this subject matter, and she doesn't have anything to say about it. I mean,
Yeah.
admittedly, I am a layperson, but I have some knowledge of it. I mean, we could have talked about something, and there you go with that sort of robot mentality of, pardon, of just going through the motions,
Yeah.
just doing it without putting much thought into it.
Mm,
And yeah, I also had a more of even more of a standard experience when I was living in Korea, at least for a couple of months. I wouldn't really call her quite an ex-wife because we were only together for a couple of months, but yeah, that was the same thing. You do what you're supposed to do as a man. You quote unquote take care of her, and she puts out.
mm,
But yeah, the last one, this was an amalgamation of I think two cultures ultimately, and the worst of American culture and the worst of Korean culture. That's just bad. Yeah. So,
yep.
but certainly one thing I can say is that based on my experience as well as what people tell me who are still active in the field, that is dating and fucking Korean women,
Mm,
they tell me that it still is very much that. I mean, if you go through the motions, you can expect them to put out, and if that's your primary interest anyway, then have no problem with that. And there's certainly been a loosening of mores, I think. But what we should probably talk about as well is how rampant prostitution is in South Korea. I mean, yeah, oldest profession in the world, but you and I'm assuming obviously, yeah. I-
yeah.
it's if you think there are prostitutes everywhere, you haven't been to South Korea. I mean, they are everywhere. Thoughts?
Um, First, I want to say I have nothing against prostitution
No, I
whatsoever.
think it's honest work for the most part.
Prostitution is officially illegal in South Korea, and they've adopted recently the so-called Swedish model, where it's illegal to buy sex, but it's not illegal to sell it. So in effect, only the man gets punished if a uh,
I wasn't aware of that.
someone is caught, buying sex services.
Hmm.
Anyway, that aside, traditionally, yes, very common everywhere. In the norebangs, there are girls. You can typically you can hire them to come in and dance with you inside. Oh, okay, a norebang is a private karaoke room. Sorry, in Korea and I think in Japan also, despite the fact that karaoke is a Japanese word, um, they don't get up in front of bars in front of everybody and start singing songs to the entire town. It's a private thing. You get a room. You got maybe 3, 4 people. There are sometimes bigger rooms when, say, workmates want to go out together, and there are like 10 of them with the company boss or something. But in any case, they're private rooms, and you have the karaoke machine there, and you sing there. So you can hire girls to come in and dance with you, and some of them, yeah, you can hire them to for sex. There are barber shops where um, part of the traditionally part of the service is barber shops for men run by women, where you get your hair cut, you get a shave, and she sucks your dick, and that's just the happy ending for your haircut.
I think they're
Uh,
also more. I mean, this was eons ago in Itaewon, which is the foreigners section in Seoul. For those who don't know, there was an entire strip where it wasn't even they weren't even trying to hide it. There was no veil of being a barber shop
it
or
used to be it used to be legal, I think. There used to be a legal red light district in Korea, I believe, but that was.
If there had been, it must have been Itaewon because they weren't even trying to hide it at the time. This was eons ago. But I forgot the exact quote, but the prostitution amounts, I think, something to the effect of like 30% of South Korean GDP, something ludicrous, some insane.
I don't know the numbers actually.
I seem to recall somewhere in the region of 30, so some very high number of things, and this is this in a super quote unquote stifling neo-Confucianist society. I have this
Hmm.
theory, which I need to do more research and work on, that these societies where you have the most, at least on the surface level, the most rigidity and conformity, uh, you tend to get a lot of weirdness and a lot of extremity below the surface. I mean, look at Japanese tentacle porn or what have you, the whole hentai thing. It seems to just sort of be boiling or rather brewing under the surface.
Well, okay, about the sex thing, I think it's actually not a contradiction, um,
Well, I don't
because we
think it's
have
a
to remember.
contradiction.
Well, it's not weird at all, and I'll tell you why. I think that because in cultures that were not uh, non-Judeo-Christo-Islamic cultures, sex was often seen as a legitimate need, especially for men, and there was, in order to keep society running functionally under the Neo-Confucian system, even it was, you had to keep that stuff out of the system and not causing problems. And so, uh, because there wasn't this mentality that sex is intrinsically bad because you are sinning against God by doing it in the wrong way, there was not that concept in the pre-Christian Asia, and that it is just a human function. And just like going to the bathroom, you sometimes you got to do it, and sometimes your wife is not. It's not convenient for her to do it all the time, and so, or you're not married, and so, yeah, there are prostitutes, and that's part of society's functioning, and that's it. And
Interesting.
it used to be that way in Europe as well before Christianity, in the Roman Empire and ancient Greece and all over the world. So I really don't think that it actually poses any kind of anomaly in the Neo-Confucian system there,
Okay, but
because the attitude about sex is
oh,
that it's simply a human function.
no, perhaps I was just more focused on the extremity of, say, a lot of the Japanese sexual stuff, where it's just
Well, Japan is kind of its own world.
it really is, and that would be the subject of a. Neither of you
I'm
nor
not an
I have
expert on
exactly, nor
Japanology.
am I.
I don't want to go there.
Yeah, exact. Same here. Same here. But yeah, I think this has been an interesting and revealing chat for those of you who weren't familiar with certain aspects of Korean society. Having heard it from the expert's mouth, the horse's mouth, as it were.
I,
Hmm.
not expert, just two people, you and I, who have had some experiences and are just reporting on our
Well,
observations.
yeah, you are electos, so electos. There's a reason. But maybe we can get Electos on for another time to talk about some loftier subjects. He's actually, as I said, he's an amateur Hellenist. He's taught himself a great deal of ancient Greek. He's highly proficient in it, far more than perhaps I had ever been. My ancient Greek is abominable.
You are much more proficient in Latin than I am, I
I
must say.
am, yeah, but that's just because of the reasons of focus. Perhaps retrospectively, I should have focused more on Greek, but yeah, I mean, and he's got some very interesting ideas about the way the way civilizations work and lost knowledge and things like that. And yeah, we might be able to talk about it another time. But I do want to focus on the Korean thing. So we are going to wrap it up here, I think, folks. I don't always want to do highfalutin off the wall topics as some people might perceive them to be in my most recent talks. Sometimes I want to get some more down to earth stuff talked about as well. So I am going to say gratias tibi pro sapientia ago electos.
Thank you for having me.
And I will see you guys the next time for another MGTOW Talks. Thank you, and as always, may the gods be with you. And don't forget to wallow in filth and misery.